This lecture, we will be discussing about bioimaging techniques and a brief history of that. So, imaging technology today, so we have here examples of your MRI scan and PET scan. So, the functional MRI is basically two types of MRI. So, you have your structural MRI, and then you have your the functional one, which models your biological system superimposed in actual the anatomical MRI image. And then so basically the functional MRI is a two image, or it's made up of two images overlap together. Now you have your on letter B, on the middle one, so that is you have the PET PET tomography scan obtained from a normal human. So the PET scan is a bit different. So if you look at it, it's more of more colorful than MRI, but less distinct. So it gives you it actually gives you an idea on where some it's more functional in its aspect. And then on this one, on this other side, on the rightmost side, you have your CT scan image. So this is a cross-sectional slice of your torso. A and B are both brain. So these are both scans of your brain, whereas your the one on the rightmost picture, that is your torso. So you can see here, this is your spine. What else can we see? We have the kidneys, and then I think this is the liver. So you have your intestinal part somewhere around here, so something like that. Okay, so here is your characteristics of bioimaging modalities. We have many different types of bioimaging scans. So we have X-rays, structural MRI, functional MRI, ultrasound. So each of them have their own characteristics. Each of them have their own function. For example, we use X-ray generally to look at bone structures, especially if there are any breaks in the bone. So X-ray is the go-to. It's actually faster and cheaper than CT scan, which is its close neighbor. It's not exactly close neighbor, very close cousin. And we have structural MRI, which, if you notice, the structural MRI has all of the functionalities of your X-ray. But structural MRI is more, one is more expensive than X-ray. So, of course, for routine checkups, we do not necessarily use structural MRI, we just use X-rays. And then functional MRI. So the differences, as you can see, the differences in the functional MRI and the structural MRI. So each of them has their own. So functional MRI cannot tell us exactly the whole structure, but it gives us blood flow. So that means we can see the function, because of course the organs that are functioning well of course will experience normal blood flow. But if you have some issues, for example, there's a clog or there's a cancerous occlusions in there, you can see that in functional MRI. So that's why in some cases we use structural and functional MRI, and then we superimpose their image so that we can know the structure, and then use the functional MRI to know if those structures are functioning well. And then unlike X-rays, structural and functional MRI produces 3D images. Okay, and in here you have your resolution. So millimeter resolution, that means you have your it's a good 3D, not exactly 3D, but it's structural view. Whereas millisecond, you can see how it functions over time. Now, aside from functional MRI, you have your ultrasound. Now, ultrasound is similar in its scope with functional MRI, except that ultrasound can also give us a structure. However, the resolution of ultrasound is not as good as your functional MRI. In fact, your ultrasounds are best for imaging, for example, prenatal imagings, so fetal images for pregnant women. So you have that. And then we have SPECT and PET. So both of them are variations of nuclear medicine. So these are nuclear imaging techniques. So you have here they actually have similar scopes. So depending on the availability of the material and the function, so each of them are being used. So they show you blood flow. So that means you can see functions here. It's more geared towards function. Whereas structure, no structure much. That's why some of them you need to superimpose them on a functional image such as your structural MRI. Then endoscopes. Endoscopes are tubes, small thin tubes that are inserted into your openings of the body. It's equipped with cameras and of course light source. So you can see the internal structure, you can see the surface, the internal surface structure. It's a millisecond because it's a camera, so it's recording videos. Millimeter and millisecond, so it's more functional. So you can see it over time. You can see the structure, you can see the surface structure. Now that's for endoscope. And then you have microscopy. Microscopy, of course, you have your smaller resolution, so micron resolution. Well, of course, it's a microscope. And then you can see it also in real time. You mostly see the surface, but sometimes you can see the 3D structure. So under microscopy, you can see it as SEM or TEM, but usually it's just similar light microscope. So histology samples, whereas you stain differential staining of tissue samples. And then we have confocal microscopy. In confocal microscopy, this gives us a more three-dimensional backdrop compared to simple microscopy. It's 2D image. Now for confocal microscopy, you can view that as a 3D image. And then MRS, magnetic resonance spectroscopy. Well, it actually similar to MRI, but it's more of a spectroscopic value, so it's 3D and in a molecular level. Unlike your MRI, which is more geared towards larger structures, MRS is more molecular in scope. So that is your those are some different biomedical imaging modalities and their functions. So each of them have their own uses. So you'll be discussing each of them or most of them in detail in the succeeding lectures. Now, historical development of imaging technology. So in here you have your cross-sectional illustration. So before the advent of photography, so of course there's no other way to create images except to draw them by hand. So how do you draw them by hand? This is a cross-section view obtained from a dead cadaver. So you cannot it's very difficult, of course, to view a live person. They usually just do with cadavers, and then from what they know about those cadavers, they apply, based on the structure, they apply it on their patients. So it's it's very primitive. And then this is the image in A, that is the first photograph taken by Joseph Nipsey in 1827. So you can see the image is very grainy. So this is 1827, so you can see the technology, the photography technology is still at its very crude. And then here is our more later, so this is brought about by digital photography. So as you can see, in here, this is, I think, a landscape photograph of some chimneys, towers, I think this is a roof. Chimneys. Actually, you barely can distinguish much structures in the early photographs, but in here, you can see this is a stump, a tree stump in a desert. So you can see here in a great resolution the cloud formations at the backdrop, and then you can see in the foreground your tree stump. So this is in black and white, but of course digital photography can also see in color. So you have a more detailed structure, the rough surfaces, etc., etc. You can see it's a greater resolution in the modern digital photography. Now, because of this photography, the technology of photography, of course, bioimaging can also be applied. So, imaging biological system through photographs is also applied in here. This is an early micrograph. This is a photograph A micrograph is basically a picture taken when you view the microscope. For example, in here, this is a microscope here. This is how it's done. You have a microscope showing your sample, and then this is the early camera. So it's a very, very long structure. So this they are using light sensitive photographic plates at that time. So you take the picture of the microscopic image here. So this is the microscopic image. So it's a diatom. So you can see here some several cellular structures of your of this organism. So this is the historical development. So over time, the different structures that we see in this the different structures that we have. So you have your if you can see here, we have come a long way. So from 1600s, the compound microscope is the peak of the technology at that time. But whereas now, that is just one of the basics instruments in a high school laboratory, the compound microscope. So you have your compound microscope, and then of course the advent of photography in 1827. So it allows us to see surface structures, and then using if you conjoining together or using photography with compound microscope, you can develop photomicrograph. So that's a 2D microstructure. And then in 1896, once you develop the X-rays, that's how the actual breakthroughs in bioimaging happened, because in X-rays you were able to see internal structures of biological systems. Human beings' internal structures can be seen now with X-rays. Then from there, you have your MRS. This is magnetic resonance spectroscopy, and then endoscope, ultrasounds, confocal microscope, and then concluding with MRI in 1973. MRI now is not exactly it's a must-have. Most hospitals nowadays have MRI, which is of a great help in helping doctors in their diagnosis. Okay, so in the next lecture video, we will be discussing about X-rays and CT scan. So see you in a while.